Today marks 74 years since the beginning of the Korean War. The war remains unresolved, however, because it only ended in a truce and without a peace agreement. One of the lingering aspects of the conflict is the issue of separated families, both on the Korean Peninsula and here in the diaspora as well. Due to the division of the Korean Peninsula and the non-existent relations between the United States and North Korea, there are approximately 100,000 Korean Americans who have not been able to see or communicate with their family members in North Korea for decades. So today's event will focus on these divided families and some of the initiatives that aim to support these families. One is the Divided Families National Registry Act, which was introduced by Representative Jennifer Wexton of California and would create a government registry for divided families. Another initiative is called Letters to My Hometown, which is a storytelling project that is archiving video messages from elderly Korean Americans to their relatives in North Korea. We have a great lineup of speakers today that will talk about these issues. Some of them will also explore the intergenerational impact of family separation and the opportunities for sustaining the collective memories of this human connection between the United States and North Korea. I will introduce our first three speakers before they talk, and then I will introduce three additional speakers who will sit together on a panel that I will moderate. And then at the end, I'll open up for Q&A. All right, so we are honored to have with us as our first speaker, Congressman Brad Sherman, who represents California's 32nd Congressional District, which is incidentally where my wife is from. She grew up in Granada Hills. He has served in Congress since 1997 and is the senior member of both the House Foreign Affairs and Financial Services Committees. Furthermore, Representative Sherman has been very active on Korea issues in the past, including with his Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act. He's also one of the co-sponsors of the Divided Families National Registry Act that I mentioned earlier. We appreciate your commitment to peace, partnership, and stability. These are values that are at the heart of the congressional mandate set out for USIP. And we're grateful that you are a trusted voice on foreign policy and national security issues in the House of Representatives. After Congressman Sherman speaks, we'll play a short video message from former Senator Mark Kirk of Illinois. During his time in Congress, Senator Kirk was very instrumental. He was a strong advocate for prioritizing the divided families issues in U.S. engagement with North Korea. He also led efforts to establish a bipartisan congressional commission on divided families, and he helped to drive legislation that supported efforts to reunite Korean Americans with their family members. So, Congressman Sherman, I now invite you to come up to the podium to provide your remarks.
Thank you very much. Hello, I'm Brad Sherman from California's best named city, Sherman Oaks, and I represent about 30 towns that are part of the city of Los Angeles, including Granada Hills. And people ask me, well, then why are you Brad Sherman? If I'm going to represent 30 towns, I'm going to live in the one that's got the right name. So I think it was toward the beginning of 2021, Casey Choi of KPAC came to me, and we sat down, and he urged me to submit a bill that did three things. One was create a liaison office between the United States and North Korea. And obviously, we don't have a great relationship with North Korea, but you make peace with your enemies, you don't make peace with your friends. And if there was ever a country where we would hope to improve the relationship, it would be North Korea. The second aspect of that was what brings you all together, and that is communication between the families. As was noted, there are 100,000 Korean Americans with families north of the 38th parallel, and we've seen just a few family unification visits, and it's been 74 years. Now people have reached the end of their lives, and if they're ever going to see their relatives, it's got to be now. And so the bill calls for the family unification visits and a review of America's policy toward allowing visits to North Korea by focusing on compelling humanitarian considerations, including witnessing funerals, burials, and other family commemorations. We need to see these visits. We also need to see telephone calls, letters, video calls. And obviously, the North Korean government has not been open and forthcoming, but the United States should be first should open the door, and second should be pushing North Korea to open the door. The third element of this bill, for which it's most known, is it calls for us to finally end the war that most people ended in 1953. And that part of the bill has gotten some significant support and some significant opposition. Now, I've served for 28 years on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and I am a former chair of the Asia Subcommittee. And I've also met a psychiatrist or two who will tell you that if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, you need to be institutionalized. It's great to be here. We're right near the State Department, which is a large institution. Institutionalized and institutions sometimes go together. So we have seen America's policy of not wanting to end the War of 1953 on the theory that somehow that's a concession to North Korea. Well, it wasn't a concession to North Korea to sign the armistice. Why would it be considered a concession to sign the peace treaty? Now, I don't know whether signing a peace treaty would get the ball rolling on some of the more current issues, but I do know that our current policy is one of trying to prevent nuclear proliferation by imposing sanctions. And how's that worked out? We have seen North Korea go from no nuclear weapons to 5 to 10 to 20 to some unclassified sources would say over 70. We have seen their missile capacity grow. And now just recently we see an explicit alliance with Russia that could well deal with an improvement of nuclear weapons and thermonuclear weapons, or may very well deal with an improvement of missiles. We know that in the past, Russia has been a better non-proliferation partner than they're given credit for, but Putin is desperate, and desperate dictators do bad things. So we have 41 co-sponsors of the bill. We also have significant opposition from those who think that it's a concession. But the bigger issue is not just ending the war, but somehow limiting the North Korea nuclear program and ending the sanctions. That's what will affect people's lives today, along with, of course, the lives that would be altered if we saw the family unification visits. The bill has substantial support. I won't say the concept behind the bill has substantial support. It appears majority support in the South Korean Parliament, and we've got supporters that I met just last month from Britain, Canada, Australia, and a host of other places. The policy of the United States has been to pound the table and say CIVID, complete, irreversible, verifiable disarmament. And that would be great if we could get it. We have not. And I think it's unlikely to occur. I remember back in the early part of this century, North Korea indicated an interest in a non-aggression pact, And Dick Cheney, who was more or less running our foreign policy back then, said, hell no. He dreamed of aggression. I know we're the good guys, but I don't think Kim Jong-un agrees. And so I do not think that he will give up all his nuclear weapons. And we have to be realistic on that. If we're not realistic, we just keep doing what we're doing. And every year, North Korea has more weapons, better weapons, bigger weapons, and they're desperate for money. So if you have a surplus of nuclear weapons and a desperate need for money, is there anyone who might buy one of your nuclear weapons? Just think of who that might be. So we go from a proliferation threat to a metastasized proliferation threat. The world would be much safer if North Korea had 10 highly monitored nuclear weapons than an unlimited number of unmonitored nuclear weapons. But you can't say our policy has been a failure. It has been a failure as far as providing for security for the world and for the American people and for the Korean people from this nuclear threat. I mean, on the one hand, it's been a success in that we haven't seen a resumption of the Korean War. But as far as the nuclear containment program, it's been a complete failure, unless you realize that it's been an incomplete success for all the politicians involved. The policy has been consistently applied. Trump applied it with great noise. Biden applies it with a very soft voice. It's the same policy. And no American politician will be criticized for pounding the table and saying North Korea should never have nuclear weapons. It doesn't accomplish anything, but there's no political risk. And no one has lost a single state in the Electoral College for taking that position. What we need instead is to be honest with the American people and say the question is there a highly limited program, or is there, as we have now, an unlimited program? So I would hope that we would move toward a liaison office, that we'd move toward family reunification visits, that we'd move to end the war of 1953, not a concession, but an equal statement by both parties that they do not wish to continue a status of war. And then finally, a negotiated end to the sanctions that involves a highly monitored and limited nuclear program. I realize I don't have a lot of support in the foreign policy think tank community on this, because nobody ever lost their tenured chair by saying North Korea should never have nuclear weapons, and they shouldn't. And if I live in a perfect world, I am sure that they won't. But I live on this planet with you. So I'm Brad Sherman from California. Thank you very much.
This is Senator Mark Kirk. I want to thank you all for coming here today to this event about divided families across the Korean Peninsula. I'm especially concerned about the plight of Korean Americans who are divided from their families up north. And also thank my dear friend Chahi Stanfield, who has served as the symbol of this movement, showing what we can still do to cure the wounds and pains of the Korean War.
I was going to thank Representative Sherman. I'll thank you in many ways, and I'll thank Senator Kirk for his very brief remarks. Right now, we'll turn to our last individual speaker, Ambassador Julie Turner, who is the U.S. Special Envoy for North Korean human rights issues. Ambassador Turner is a globally recognized human rights and democracy expert, and she's worked over the last 20 years to strengthen democratic institutions and promote human rights throughout East Asia and the Pacific region. Previously, she served as the East Asia Office Director in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the State Department, as well as the Director for Southeast Asia at the National Security Council. We appreciate your efforts to keep the spotlight on North Korean human rights and humanitarian concerns, despite the current diplomatic stalemate between the U.S. and North Korea. It's an honor to have you here, and I invite you to come as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Frank, for the kind introduction, and thank you, NUSIP, for hosting this meaningful event today. It's an honor to be here with Korean American divided family members and groups and individuals committed to helping them. I've had the pleasure of meeting with many divided family members during my tenure in this position, and this has been such a priority for me in this role that they were, in fact, one of my first meetings. I had the opportunity to host Cha-hee and a number of other divided family community members at the State Department. I want to thank Congressman Sherman for his remarks earlier, as well as both the remarks and the work that former Senator Mark Kirk has done in this space. I know that he has been deeply committed to family reunifications, even in retirement in Illinois. So it was very wonderful to meet with him, to see Cha-hee and others when I was last in Chicago a few months ago. I can't emphasize enough how critical civil society is to raising awareness of the unique challenges that Korean American divided family members face, addressing what they need, and convening leaders from all different sectors to facilitate family reunifications for them as soon as possible. Civic organizations such as KoreanAmerican.org, Divided Families USA, and the National Coalition of the Divided Families from 14 different states, which are represented at today's event, are truly driving forces for U.S. DPRK family reunions. As I mentioned, since day one as U.S. Special Envoy on North Korean human rights issues, and in the many years before working on North Korean human rights issues, my priority has been listening to the voices of Korean divided families and Korean American, Korean diaspora communities, and ensuring that we are incorporating the voices of the Korean diaspora community and Korean Americans in our foreign policy making. One thing that struck me in one of my engagements with the divided family members is that one individual said, "This is the first time that a U.S. government official has met with me. I've served the U.S. Overseas in Vietnam and feel like my government has not been listening to my pleas for help, that I do want to be able to go home to my hometown and see where my mother is buried." These stories, each of these interactions that I have, each individual one has left an imprint on my heart every time that I meet with this group. The stories are heartbreaking, and I do want to apologize on behalf of the U.S. government for not doing more sooner. I have told this story a couple of times recently, that many of you know that I'm a Korean American adoptee, and it's not the same type of experience, but similarly understand the kind of desire to return home, if you will. When I was a young college student, I did travel back to Korea to do a birth parent search. When I got to Korea, I found out that the individual who was listed on my paperwork as my biological father had passed away just a few months before. And so in many ways, I think back to the different regrets that I had as a younger person in not choosing to make that decision to go home earlier or to do that search earlier in my life. But I do understand that feeling of not wanting to be too late. And so this sense of urgency that Cha-hee and other divided family members are feeling right now, I wanted to just extend my sympathy and to express that on the U.S. government side, we're going to do what we can to get there. Representative Sherman raised many of the current challenges that exist in this space, but we're resolved to trying to seek solutions that help us to be able to facilitate these family reunifications. I've now met with divided family members in California, Hawaii, New York, locally in Maryland and Virginia, as well as DC, and in Chicago. And I will continue to visit with these groups in every domestic trip that I do. I've also prioritized just the family impact on my recent trips to Korea as well as Japan in chatting with abductee families and other separated family members in both of those countries. In these engagements that I've had domestically, though, I think one of the most important pieces of this for me has been listening to an audience that hasn't felt like they've had a voice for a long time. And I've heard that there are a lot of diverse views out there in terms of what the U.S. government should do, what the needs are, and we're working to find ways to incorporate the broad range of views to be able to offer solutions that really fit the needs of the community. And this includes, for example, the idea of the National Registry. This also includes supporting the great work of Paul and others who are documenting these stories through video testimonies, and hopefully looking for a way that the government can help facilitate storage of those videos for future purposes. But also thinking about how we're defining family and who should be included in this process. These are all conversations that I know are going on in the community that we are incorporating into our thinking. My own personal viewpoint here is to think of family as expansively as possible and to let people define how they're defining family rather than have it enforced on them by the government. And so thinking about how we can incorporate the broad views of the impacted individuals. At the end of the day, we're prioritizing this because no one deserves family separation. It's inhumane and traumatic. Divided families currently living in the United States and in North Korea are aging and are running out of time. The clock is ticking and their reunification is a matter of utmost urgency. So as we continue to message to the DPRK that the United States is ready to talk right now without any preconditions, we are hoping to put out there different areas in which the North Koreans might be willing to communicate. And I hope that they will hear us in thinking through these issues, particularly the divided families and family reunifications, because of the humanitarian mission underneath of this effort. And so we will continue to signal and message our readiness to get back to the table. We're ready to proceed with in-person and virtual family reunions by building on an official or regular system or channel and welcome opportunities to Korean Americans and their families to visit to their ancestral hometowns in the DPRK. So looking for also ways to open that pathway, that it doesn't just have to be isolated meetings. Hopefully we can make this a regularized process. I would again like to highlight the pivotal role of civil society and family reunification efforts, especially the importance of multi-generational engagement. Not only is it important to educate young people about what happened in our history and how to remember that, but they are the future and will carry this issue forward and help us to find those real solutions to the family separations issue. I'm really pleased to see so many young people in the audience today. I know I am hitting that older category of people, but I do sometimes feel like when I'm out talking about North Korean human rights issues, or even the family reunification issue, that the audience tends to be on the older end of the spectrum. But it's so important for these stories to be carried forward. Again, a big kudos to Paul for his effort and his Letters to My Hometown project. His global advocacy are really excellent examples of how the next generation can bring new perspectives, new tools, galvanize new resources to help advance these efforts to reunite divided families, as well as KoreanAmericanStory.org, led by Mr. H.J. Lee, which provides a terrific platform to share such initiatives and document stories of the divided families as part of broad Korean American history. I have also been really moved in my interactions with divided family members when I do see second and third generation Korean Americans there, both to support their parents or their grandparents and in telling these stories, but also I think a lot of them are also similarly curious. It's interesting to me, even at the State Department. Sometimes I was in Seoul recently just wandering around our embassy in between meetings, and a few of the Korean Americans serving in Seoul right now popped by and said, hey, you know, I don't know if you know this, but my grandmother was born in the North. And so there are a lot of these stories that exist out there. And I think it's important that we continue to tell them. And so very much appreciate the efforts of those that are working to document these stories and to pass them on to future generations. There's a lot of great opportunity, especially right now with innovation and digitalization as instruments that can help kind of pull together this identity and support the Korean American divided families. I'm proud to be able to work with all of the people in this room that are working to energize governments. I'm going to do my best to also galvanize support from like-minded partners and allies to work with the Republic of Korea, as well as the international community to highlight this at the UN and other multi-national fora. We can't complete this mission without each and every one of you and the contributions that you're making. To those of you who I've had the opportunity to meet, I have found your work to be extremely motivational and inspirational. To those of you who I have not had the opportunity to meet, I hope that we'll have a few seconds to chat after this, because I would love to hear more about your efforts and what you're doing to support this effort. But again, thank you, Frank and USIP, for hosting today, and I look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Turner. So at this point, I'd like to invite our three panelists to come up and join me on the stage, and then we'll start our panel discussion, and I'll also introduce them as well. And then later on, we'll invite Ambassador Turner to come join us on the stage as well. But why don't you take the last three seats down there in order? Last three seats. Oh, last two seats. All right, so let me go ahead and introduce our three speakers. First, we have Paul Cuman Lee, who is the president of Divided Families USA, through which he has supported research, advocacy, and storytelling on Korean American divided families since 2016. He's currently based at Korean Peninsula community in Northern Ireland, and he also previously worked here at USIP on Northeast Asia and youth issues. So welcome back, Paul. Next is, I'm going to go to H.J., who is H.J. Lee, who's the executive director of Korean American Story, which is a storytelling nonprofit organization whose mission is to create, share, and preserve the stories of the Korean American experience. These stories, which are intended to promote reconciliation and healing, will be archived at USC's Korean Heritage Library. And then we have Chai Lee Stanfield, who is a Korean American divided family member herself, and the executive. Yes, that's definitely worthy of applause. And the executive director of the National Coalition for Divided Families. She has been working with various members of Congress for over 2 decades to pass legislation in support of the divided family issue. So let's all just give them an initial warm welcome and applause. Now, Paul, I know that you want to introduce the Letters to My Hometown project, so let me turn it over to you briefly before we start our panel discussion.
Frank. Thanks so much, Frank. And thanks, Frank. I worked here for 3 years, so I should know how to use this thing. But now, as I look around the room, I see so many familiar faces of friends and allies and mentors and partners. So it feels like I'm coming home again. And thank you, Frank, for making this possible. And thank you to Ambassador Turner for all that you are doing, and for sharing a bit about your personal story as well. So that's what I hope to do. And instead of speaking on behalf of divided families, I wanted to share a clip from this project, just in 1 second. But I did want to share something about the motivation, because Frank mentioned that I've been involved with Divided Families advocacy since 2016. And I remember the first time that I met Chahi and Frank, and HJ was actually in DC in 2016, and Chahi and I were advocating for a House Concurrent Resolution 40, which Hannah Kim's a huge champion of, and many other occasions as well. But I realized, I still remember in 2022, December, I had gotten the news that my grandfather had passed away without knowing what had happened to his older brother, from whom he was separated during the Korean War. And I remember getting an email from Chahi maybe an hour after getting the message from my mother about my grandmother. And she had told me that the Divided Families Reunification Act had passed through the National Defense Authorization Act. And it was something that we had worked so hard for. But I remember feeling like, like what Ambassador Turner was saying, it's maybe it's too late for people like my grandfather. So that's how I was motivated to work on storytelling, by partnering with people like HJ, Korean American Story, and thanks to the American Friends Service Committee. So, Matt, if you could play the clip, and then we can share a bit more about the project afterwards.
그러니까 어머님 한 뱃속에 난 친동생을 70년이 넘도록 얼굴을 모르는 거예요.
사진은 보셨어요?
만나질 못하니까. 야, 내가 내년에는 또 못 오겠고, 내후년에 또 와서 너희들 다시 만나마. 그리고 헤어졌는데, 그게 지금 26년이 됐네요. 동생들한테 거짓말쟁이가 된 거죠. 근데 이게 내가 나이 이제 90살이 됐는데, 이제 이 현 정권이 미국은 내년이면 또 달라져서 딴 정부가 들었을지 모르지만 우리 한국 정부는 아직도 한 4년 남아있는데 그 안에 무슨 변화가 있을지 그래도 그때까지 살아있으라는 보장도 없는 거고 북한을 방문할 수 있는 기회만 생긴다면 바로 그날로만 가서 동생들은 다 만나보고서 수고해야 되지 않겠나 그런 생각이죠.
Yeah, I remember that interview at a Korean restaurant outside Philadelphia with Mr. Lee, who looks pretty good for 90 years old. But this was about a year ago in Philadelphia, and that was one of the 26 interviews that I did in 6 different states across the country in about a month. And there are a lot of things that I've learned at USIP working, on writing policy briefs and I guess not using how to use a mic properly, but I guess working on events like this, but I did not learn how to operate a camera properly or any of the training that's necessary for a proper, I should have gotten some pointers from HJ. But all this to say, it was very, very grassroots. I just had a backpack and was going across the country. But it really was because I felt the sense of urgency. And I asked 3 questions to each of the elderly family members. What do you remember about your hometown in North Korea? What do you remember about your family members? And if your family members in North Korea could hear this video, what would you want to tell them? So that was a bit of a snippet, but just the last thing that I'll say before turning it back to Frank is, in terms of my hope and goal for the project, was ultimately about healing and closure. from this trauma of family separation. And I hope that this project can do that, not just for this first generation of family members, but also for younger generations who can continue to watch these videos and messages in the US and in North Korea, and also for just the broader public in both sides of the border and around the world as well, to empathize with the pain of family separation. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Frank. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think this worked now. Okay, great. And you said there were 26 videos total on the website? Okay, just similar to this one. Okay, great. So I want to start by asking each person about your personal connection to this issue. And Paul, you talked about it a little bit when you were talking about your grandfather earlier. But let's start with Chahi, and then we'll go to HJ, and then Paul, if you have any additional thoughts you want to add. But answering the question of what got you involved on this project.
19. First of all, I want to thank you for being here, and I feel so proud. I feel so good to see Hannah, Esther, Paul, young people here, because when they grew up, when we were having problems, with our family members, we wanted our children to fly. Wouldn't do anything to do with the first generation's tragedy. We wanted them to be far, far away and achieve the American dreams and be happy. But when they grew up, they flew back to their heritage, and they're carrying our cross with us. And I'm so grateful. I'm so proud of our young generation here. Thank you. I happened to visit Manchuria in 1988. I was born in a deep mountain village called the Tapuchahe, which was the mountain village where the Korean, guerrillas were hiding, which was the hideout place for the Korean guerrillas. And my father had about 120 people, men cultivating the agricultural land in the Manchuria area. And these men were armed. They worked during the day in the fields, but at night they were armed to protect the village from the bandits, which were common in those days. According to the area history and my family history, my father provided the food and the weapons to the Korean guerrillas. And the leader of the Korean, they call it Yugyokdae, Dongrigun, the fighters was the future Prime Minister Kim Il-sung, and one of the leader guy in that company was my father's youngest brother. And I was born in 1940, and my family moved as soon as right after the World War II. My family moved returned to our hometown, which was Daegu City. But my father and one of my brothers stayed there to wrap up the business, and that was the last time we saw them. So in 1988, I visited my birthplace, which was still really deep, primitive village. Then the next year, before that, I had been in charge of the branch library in other area. But the next year, in 1989, the branch managers, the branch director's position was vacant at the Albany Park Library, which was located in the heart of the Korean community. So I transferred to the Albany Park Library, and within 1989, so by 1924, I received two huge grants from the Illinois State and built a Korean collections with a nonfiction and fiction. We had to make room to house that. That attracted the Koreans from all of the Chicago and from 107 suburbs. And the library was crowded with the Korean patrons. And a lot of them were divided family members. That was 1990 when in South Korea they started the reunion process. So that affected to us too. So there was the beginning of our divided. Someone had to do something, and I did a search. Nothing was done. I couldn't find any documents or no literature on divided family work in the United States, and I didn't know where to start. But someone had to start. So in March 2000, I went to see a man named Mark Kirk who was running for Congress. So I told him our issue. So that's where the Korean American divided family work started. Okay, thank you.
H.A.
Hello? Okay. No, this is good, thank you. Unlike Paul, this is a foreign milieu for me. I feel very uncomfortable. I don't know anything about policy, legislation. I'm just a storyteller. So, but, I got involved primarily because, Paul called me up and looked at me with those puppy eyes and said, "Can you help me out?" And I was like, "Of course." My father-in-law, my late father-in-law, Byung Cho, and my mother-in-law, Jung Cho, are both from Hamgyong, southern Hamgyong province, what is now North Korea. And he was from Hamhung, and she was from Orejin, I think. I think that's the name. My father-in-law had in 1950, when the war broke out, he was 18, and he decided to join the South Korean army. So he signed up, got shipped to South Korea. All his family stayed behind. And it's kind of like that, the ode to my father, the boat leaves, doors close, that's it. And so he's had to fend for himself ever since. My mother-in-law was more fortunate in that she got to escape with her parents. But she also had some adventures along the way. And one of the stories that she told me was that when they were taking train down south, there was no room on the train, so they would have to climb up to the roof. And it's kind of dangerous if you fall asleep on top of a train because you'll fall off and die. So the father would wrap themselves with a blanket so that if one of them falls asleep, you wouldn't die. That's kind of the typical story of their journey down south. My father, in his later years, in the 80s and 90s, 1980, 1990s, when the doors were open, he visited North Korea several times. And he got to meet his relatives. It was a bittersweet experience for him, I think, because he was really devastated by the abject poverty that he experienced. One trip, he came back literally with the clothes he was wearing and the shoes he was wearing. He almost lost the shoes because they wanted it. But he literally gave away everything he had to his relatives. And when he came back, he would start sending money, knowing very well that, a lot of it probably didn't make it to his family, but he couldn't not send it. So, it was really powerful to watch something like that or hear about stories about things like that. Years later, when I was interviewing him, I said, was it difficult for you to leave Korea to immigrate to the US? And he said, no, because I was a refugee in the South. So it never really felt like home to me. I thought that was a really interesting comment. So for me, it's, quite personal. But also, as an organization, we record stories of many memories of folks who have experiences of the Korean War, as well as folks who have families that they've left behind. So it's kind of, for me, both professional and personal as to why I'm involved in this project.
If I could just add one thing about my personal connection. I was just reminded, and HJ, you were just sharing about your father and difficulty or how easy it was to come to the U.S. But Mr. Lee, whose snippet of the interview you just saw from Philadelphia, I remember asking him, about how he came to the U.S. And he was saying one of the main reasons for him was to immigrate to the U.S. was so that he had an easier time visiting North Korea, and it would be easier for him to have the possibility to reunite with his family. And I was just reminded of that because ultimately for me, it's personal. You have 3 generations of Korean Americans here today, at least 3 generations. And I remember at USIP, it was when I was working at USIP when I naturalized as a U.S. citizen. For me, I was born in South Korea. My family came to the States when I was 5, and then I grew up here, but I still held on to my South Korean citizenship until much later in life. But ultimately, I think working on this issue and this project in particular it's not only hopefully benefiting people from the first generation, but also helping me navigate my own identity as a Korean American. And I think a lot of people, people here, people watching the live stream, you might be familiar with the issue of divided families from the Korean War. You've seen the videos of reunions at Kumgang Mountain where people, tearfully hug each other for just 3 days and then have to separate again. But I think, especially in the U.S., there's not really a widespread recognition that this is an American issue. This is a domestic issue as well. That so many people like Cha-hee, like Senator Kirk, like Congressman Sherman have been working on for the past 2 decades, if not more. So that's a bit more about the personal connection for me.
Paul, I'd like to stay with you just for a second because you've worked on Korean issues for a while, certainly policy analysis, but also on the grassroots issues like the Letters to My Hometown project. So I want to get your thoughts on what do you think the role is of this type of issue as it pertains to U.S. DPRK reconciliation. Do you see a role?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just compared to inter-Korean relations, North and South Korea, there have been over 20 of these in-person reunions. There have been letters that have been exchanged across the border. There have been video messages that have been archived. But none of those official mechanisms have been possible for Korean Americans. And I think when you think about the U.S., and Frank, you're the expert on this, of a U.S. and reconciliation with kind of these enemy states, but even compared to countries like Cuba or Vietnam, Cuban Americans, Vietnamese Americans had been able to travel to their homeland to meet with their family members in the past. So, this is, for me, how I see it, more than a human rights issue, more than a humanitarian issue. This is a human issue that I think can kind of build the basis of trust and understanding. And, I really think it's exceptional, not in a good way. It's an outlier, even in other divided countries when you compare to East and West Germany, for example, where people have been separated physically and without any communication for so long. So, I think it could be the starting point of reconciliation between Washington and Pyongyang.
It's and I'm glad you raised that. It's important to note that so there's a travel ban on U.S. citizens going to North Korea that I believe was implemented in 2018 following the Otto Warmbier situation. But prior to that travel ban, approximately 800 to 1,000 Korean Americans visited North Korea every year. It sounds a little bit strange to think about that, But that was the case. A lot were going on their own. There were some going for tourism, maybe business, a lot for church reasons, but many who are going on their own to try to meet with their family members and also provide remittances where possible, right? HA, let me turn to you. So the Korean American story that you focus on is primarily dealing with storytelling, right? And then you also deal with the legacies of the Korean War. What do you see as the role of storytelling in terms of healing intergenerational trauma?
It's so important for us as an organization. We're 14 years old now. We've been collecting Korean American stories for 14 years. And looking forward, I think that's going to be, well, it has been a byproduct of the work that we do. Storytelling is probably one of the few ways that you could really create authentic empathy, which is the pathway to healing and reconciliation. So for us as an organization, that goal is paramount. When we talk about divided families, there's the physically divided families, but I'm also concerned about the impact of the Korean War in our families and how it's dividing us emotionally, culturally, linguistically, in so many ways. There are so many forces against us. You know, when people immigrate to this country, they brought with them, the first generation of my parents' generation and grandparents' generation came with traumas of the war. And then you add to it the traumas of immigration, racism, just all the different things that they have to put up with. It's a lot to do. And so if you talk to the older generation, they tend to have the perspective of, I think, not really wanting to think about it because it's so traumatic. But when we interview these folks, we try to tell them that the fact that we're traumatized is something we couldn't control. So there's nothing to be ashamed of. It's not something to be guilty about. But what we can do is we have a choice as to what we do with this trauma. And I try to tell them that you have an opportunity to take your trauma and turn it into a blessing for your family. And you do that by telling your story. By honoring your story, the children have an understanding of resilience, grit, all the things that made you survive. These are positive things that we need to perpetuate. When I talk to the younger generation, I try to tell them that it's difficult to communicate with them and it's difficult to understand their fixation on higher education, preferably at Harvard, becoming a professional doctor or lawyer, without really understanding their past survival situation where they didn't know when they were going to eat, if they were worried about their safety, there's lack of stability. These are things that drove them. And unless you understand where that is coming from, you can't really have a communication that's productive. So we try to emphasize that in order to have peace, reconciliation, and healing, empathy is really the key. And empathy doesn't mean you have to agree with what the other side says. It just means you have to hear it so that you can understand where they're coming from and why they say the things they may say or why they behave in the way that you may not like, but at least you understand it. And I think this is a really important role of storytelling. And that's why, for us, I think that's something that we will continue to focus, healing, that is, healing our community, not only, because the power, the trauma that exists in our community is just incredible. It's the 800-pound gorilla. There's 2 million of us. There's 150,000 adoptees, right? And there's probably over 100,000 GI wives in this country. And let's think about it. All of us are here because of the war. And so it's a pretty powerful force.
Thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't. I brought up the issue of the travel ban, and I do want to say that the Biden administration has been very, very helpful in trying to provide ways to address some of the humanitarian concerns, including ways to provide exemptions on a case-by-case basis for divided family members who are trying to reconnect with their kin in North Korea. And so that's something that needs to be mentioned as well. Yes, I was going to turn to you anyways, but let me ask you the question, and then you can also address the point that you're trying to make as well. So you've been advocating for the Korean American community on this issue for over a quarter century.
Yeah,
What are the...
Century, yeah.
A long time you've been,
long
yes,
time.
a long time. Sorry if I get the numbers wrong, but so you have a lot of experience based on those years. What are the challenges, the main challenges you faced on this issue? And then conversely, what gives you hope as we move forward?
Okay, well, we are not done yet, so don't close the whole book. We still have.
Please use your microphone.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So we are not done. We are still here. We are at the very end of our lives, but don't close the book yet. So you guys are telling the story, so fine, but we're not done yet. So wait for a little longer. What was your question?
It's about the challenges that you face on this issue.
Probably the first generation's difficulty with language and cultural barrier. Yeah, it could have done a lot earlier and got it down probably by now, but we didn't know. I didn't know where to start. I had no idea how to get this through the U.S. government. In Korea, you don't have to go to a representative explain what the divided family means is. You don't have the Korean government and the Korean Red Cross take care of those things. But here we had to go take pictures and stories to tell the politicians with our language. I mean, we don't know even, sometimes we don't know what we are talking about. So it has been challenging for the first generation to get through the U.S. government, to work with the U.S. government, and to work with the mainstream America. Did I answer my question?
Right, and following up on that, what gives you hope?
Oh, we still hope. We have a lot of things to hope. And first of all, I would like to mention these bills. Thanks to Ambassador Turner, we have a bill in the House and in the Senate. It says directs the state, the nature of the bill is directs the State Department to establish a government-sponsored registry for the divided Korean American families. The registrations have been the problem which caused of the failure of our first bill. And even somewhat to the second bill, we have no official capacity to take the registrations. So I took some registrations through my website, and after doing a nationwide publicity, when a resolution or a bill is passed in the House, and on special events such as Singapore summit. And before, if I tell you about the registrations, probably I can explain where we are. before the Singapore summit, I filed 105 registrations at the State Department. To next year, in April 2019, Ambassador Began called us and asked us to get ready for a video reunion before or after Hanoi summit. So I called everybody on my list, and 15 out of 105 either they have passed away or their phone numbers are disconnected. So I added several more, and I filed 97 registrations at the State Department. And thanks to Esther Im, I have a graphic showing the age distribution. 85% of them were in their late 80s or 90s. That was 4 or 5 years ago. Since then, we have had COVID. The situation in North Korea is even worse because of the food shortage and the COVID. So if the reunion happens, it wouldn't resemble the reunions held between South and North Korea, which you have seen on TV. Congressman Sherman just mentioned the Casey Choi. Casey Choi has his father's ashes at home because his father wished to be buried in hometown. I met another lady from Texas. She also has her father's ashes at home for the same reason. We have the ambassador met Elder Jang Song, who's 91 years old. He left home when he was 17 years old. He didn't even get to say goodbye to his parents and his siblings. He would like to visit his hometown to find an area where he could bring the remains of his parents, and his siblings together. Some of the divided family members would like to visit their parents' graves. So we are in a different situation from the reunion the South Korean government has had. We are at the very end of our lives, but still, I think we can do something with the help from the ambassador, who has been wonderful with us. So the whole book is not closed yet. We are on the very last chapter, but we are working on it. And thank you.
Thank you. And also the work continues with the younger generation. That gives me hope. Paul, Hannah, Esther, and others. And also on the issue of hope, I thought Congressman Sherman was going to mention this, but he didn't. I don't want to steal his thunder, but I'll mention it because he didn't, is that the Divided Families National Registry Act comes up for a vote tonight. And so that's something to look out for as well. Let me just ask one more question, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And this is for all of you, just really quickly. What does healing or closure mean to you? Is it, does it have to be unification? Does it have to be the ability to travel freely or knowing the status or whereabouts of your loved one? What ultimately at this point does healing and closure mean for you? And I'll start with Chao-hee and then go to HJ and then Paul.
I don't know how you can close our stories can go on, but how can you close? Can you stop missing your parents or missing your hometown you left 70, 60 years ago? I don't think there's a closure for us. Divided family members buried their pain and the suffering in their hearts, and they took them to their graves. I don't know whether you can call it closure, but that's what we will do.
HJ.
I feel very unqualified to answer this question. I guess some answers, just knowing, I think. In my mother, my mother-in-law's case, she's never really been able to visit North Korea with her. So even just knowing what happened, but, that was 7 years ago, who's still alive. And so I agree with Chahi that, closure may not be a good word, but maybe some healing, the ability to move on, just knowing, I think would be something that would be helpful.
So I left USIP and Washington and the US 2 years ago for Northern Ireland. So I just flew in from Northern Ireland last night. And a few days ago, I participated in an event called the Day of Lament, or the Day of Reflection, where people come together, and there's a 30-year conflict in Northern Ireland to remember the victims. Doesn't matter which side they were on. It doesn't matter what happened to them, but for people to come together to remember and grieve and mourn. And I think through this project, I've learned that it's not, I ask people this question, and for some people, it's getting to visit and have a proper burial. For others, it's just knowing what happened, as HJ said. But in Korean, there's no proper translation. Maybe it's my lack of mastery of Korean, but in the Korean language, there's no exact translation for closure or healing. You just say like healing in a Korean accent, or it's like this concept of han, it's very cliche, 한을 풀어주다. Like setting the grief free in a way. And I found that, I was working with this organization in Northern Ireland, Healing Through Remembering. And the point I want to make with this is it's not all just sad stories about never getting to see your family member again. There's some of that in these stories, but what I found were stories about azalea flowers in people's hometowns as they were reminiscing about their childhood, as they were getting spanked by their mother on their way to primary school, skiing, the ducks in someone's hometown. And I think it's really through remembering and reminiscing that healing and closure is possible.
Thank you. So before we open up for Q&A, I'd like to invite Ambassador Turner back up into the stage so that she can answer any questions that people may have. We have about 20 minutes, so I'll open it up. And there are people with microphones. If you have a question, just raise your hand. And then also for people online, there should be a function that allows you to ask a question online, and then we'll have one of our runners, we'll have Kemi ask the question. So let's start right here.
Hi, my name is Terrence Matsuo. I'm a non-resident fellow at KEI. So before I begin, thanks, Frank, and everyone on the panel for this very interesting discussion. And so in the UN administration's Indo-Pacific strategy, there was one line that said, quotes, "The 7.3 million Korean expatriates will also play an important role for the freedom, peace, and prosperity of the Indo-Pacific." And so my question for the panel is, as Korean Americans, is there a role for the South Korean government to play in these types of issues? And, if so, what are those kinds of expectations? Thank you.
Great. The question is about the role of the South Korean government in helping reunite divided families among the Korean Americans.
It's a very limited. I'm sorry. Okay. In 1985, the South Korean government and North Korean government had agreement on the about the divided family issue, and the Korean American divided families were excluded from their agreement. So the South Korean government cannot play a role in the Korean American divided families reunion process.
Yeah, I guess I'll just briefly say, because I've been focused on the story archiving, and maybe it's better than nothing that family members from North and South Korea can meet for a few days, never to see each other again. But I don't think that's the ideal form when Ambassador Turner has talked about victim-centered approach to divided families and human rights, and trauma-informed approach. I wouldn't say inter-Korean family reunions are the most suitable for trauma-informed, because there's a risk of re-traumatization. But the one thing I will say is I do think there is precedent in terms of infrastructure and systems from the South Korean government and Ministry of Unification, who have done very detailed, regular surveys of the number of divided families, of collecting letters and messages. So I think there's a lot to learn from that, even if Korean Americans aren't going through the same channels.
I'll just jump in and say ditto to what Paul said, but also to really kind of underscore that the Koreans have set up this structure. They have a history that does have pros and cons that go along with it. But those are important lessons for us to learn from as we move forward in our own approach. But also to the point that I made earlier, there really the U.S. government should feel, I don't want to say a burden, but at least some remorse that we have not been more active at listening to the broader Korean American community on this issue for so long, for being inaccessible, right? And I do think that a number of actions that the Biden administration has taken have been to find a more inclusive process that allows various AA and HPI communities, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander communities, to be able to be integrated into our policymaking process. And this piece here is one of the efforts that we've undertaken. Me going out to various cities and communities across the United States has been to do that, to make sure that the Korean American community has a voice in this process, and the U.S. government is representing Americans, right? I also would say that there is generally, in not just the divided families issue, but in North Korea policy work as a whole, this kind of perception that it's a Korean issue, Korean diaspora, Korean Americans, South Koreans. This is a Korean thing, but it's not. It's an issue that affects Americans as a whole, and so also in looking at the great diversity around this room, but also thinking about the great diversity across America, that I hope that this is something that Korean American divided family members can look to the broader community, to their friends, their colleagues, their neighbors, to also support them in that effort, right? This should be Americans speaking on behalf of other Americans as well.
Yeah, I appreciate the efforts by not only the Biden administration, but the Trump administration, Steve Biegun's office, to advocate on behalf of U.S. citizens during negotiations with North Korea on these issues, not only divided families, but also for the families of service members from the Korean War who were trying to recover and repatriate the remains of their loved ones from the Korean War. So a lot of appreciation for that as well.
Before the Singapore summit, in late 2017, North Korea presented 3 issues to the U.S. government, releasing 3 Korean American prisoners, returning the remains of the U.S. soldiers from the Korean War, and working on the divided family issue. the Trump administration took the first two issues and dropped our issue. We understand that the former president spoke our issue to Prime Minister Kim Jong-un at the summit, but we don't know the content of the words.
Thank you for that information. I think we had one more question here. Okay. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for doing this, and thank you so much for sharing your personal stories. I'm a reporter with Voice of America Korean Service. My name is Young-Gyu Kim. One question for H.J. Lee, just a personal question. Did your father-in-law tell you why he decided to choose to join South Korean troops?
Yeah, he did.
The microphone.
Sorry about that. He did. He said that. Yeah, I'm trying to remember exactly, but basically he was going to be conscripted by the North Korean army, and for whatever reason he decided that that's not. I think he had this whole communist mindset, right? Very typical of the people of that generation. And he said he ran away. In fact, he had to go hide for 2 weeks, even from his own family, because he didn't want to jeopardize his family in case they interrogated them. So there was a lot of that kind of conscription going on at that time. So he didn't specifically say why he didn't want to join, but he said, I ran away to get away from that, and then I decided to join the South Korean army.
And just one more question for Ambassador. Dealing with North Korean human rights has always been a difficult job, I assume. And considering the current geopolitical environment, namely the recent summit between Russia and North Korea, and people assume that it might have emboldened Kim Jong-un and his regime, do you think it made your job much more difficult?
I think, while, and we say this a lot, the human rights situation is inextricably linked to international peace and security. And I know in the ROK, the ROK government likes to say they're two sides of the same coin. And I completely agree with that. And we see that interconnectedness in the military cooperation between the DPRK and Russia, sales of missiles that are then being used to commit human rights abuses in Ukraine, or overseas workers who are in forced labor-like conditions, who are then sending money back to the regime to fund the WMD program. Those connections undoubtedly exist. But I will also say, on the human rights side, we are looking at North Korea's human rights record in the same way that we look at, I don't want to pick on any particular government, I will say the ROK, just because I will not single out any other authoritarian regimes in the region. But, we're looking at the North Korean government and judging it against the same standards that we report in our annual human rights report on the South Korean government, on the Japanese government, on Vietnam, on Laos, on Thailand, on treaty allies like the Philippines, right? Those reports that are written are weighed against universal values that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They are governed by numerous UN treaty bodies, some of which the North Koreans are a party to. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, CEDAW, many other institutions. And so, while some of these other geopolitical issues definitely make things more complicated, the standards that we're asking the North Koreans to meet on human rights are the same standards that we're asking any other government around the world to meet. And so that doesn't change that. It is always hard to make progress with a government that doesn't want to talk to you. But we're going to continue to message. And I continue to remain hopeful that at the end of the day, we continue to convey our concern for the North Korean people. And a government's responsibility is to take care of its people. And that's what we're asking the North Korean government to do.
Questions? Let's go to Esther up in the front row.
Thank you. This question is for Ambassador Turner. I don't want to get ahead of the legislation that's being considered because Senate bill also has to get passed. And but I was hoping if you could share a little bit more about how you're thinking about this national registry. Should you be authorized and appropriated to do so? Have you thought about this a little bit more? What would it look like? What would you need from the community? What help can the community provide you?
I'm going to divorce my answer from the legislation because I'm not allowed to comment on pending legislation. But I will say one of the things when I stepped into this role and was thinking about how to tackle the divided family issue to begin with. I was Paul was one of the first people who emailed me, and he connected me with Chai and others on this issue. But also really grappled with this idea of, one, this was a relatively new issue to me, and then looking for resources that existed about the scope and scale of the problem. Where are most of the divided families living? How do I do outreach to the community and thinking about that? And I think that all applies when thinking about how you would go through a process of establishing a registry and the value of a registry. Some of this is, one, making sure, to Chahi's earlier point about some of the challenges that the first generation has faced, is the language barrier. In Washington, D.C., we kind of sit here in our hole, and I think Congressman Sherman said our institutional building over across the street. How do we get out to the communities? How do we make sure that we're meeting people where they're at, as opposed to forcing people to find us? I'm not expecting every Korean American divided family member to have access or to even be interested in the State Department's Facebook page. I'm sure you're all following it, maybe. I'm also dating myself by using Facebook as the suggested app there. But thinking about how we get out and really canvass within the communities with Korean speakers who can help make sure that we're collecting the right information and being connected to other people that may not be able to find us, so that we're getting out and finding them. And then also, I referenced this or alluded to this a little bit in my remarks, but thinking about also allowing people to self-select in, right? There are people that are concerned about handing their information over to the U.S. government. I myself am super paranoid about this all the time. What am I putting online? Who am I giving this to? So thinking about how we're going to secure the information, make sure that it remains protected and is respectful of privacy rights, but is accessible. I'm building my own challenges out now to answer the other question as well. But also, should a second generation person be able to register? Should a North Korean refugee who's now resettled and has American citizenship now be able to register, seeking out connections with their family members? I think giving options, leaving it broad, having it be victim-centered, so that people can self-select in is also really important, because I don't want to prevent somebody who has, it may be a third-generation person who heard their grandparents' stories, who wants to see it through. It may be a family member who's got somebody's ashes in their home, who wants to make sure to keep their father's promise to take their grandfather's ashes back home. And so we're going to be looking at this expansively. We're also going to be reaching out to a lot of the groups that are represented here today in the community, Korean American groups, to help us make sure that we're reaching the broadest range of people as possible.
Paul, I think Ambassador Turner was trying to hint that you should do a TikTok to promote this issue.
I don't know. I can't endorse TikTok, but...
all right. So I do want to take, I think I saw one more hand, and then I'll go to Cami to do one or two. One? Okay. So was there one more question in the audience? All right, we'll go here, and then we'll go to Kemi, and then those will be the last two questions. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kenji. This year, actually, Beyond Utopia documentary movie for North Korean defectors. Like that, so how about making such a documentary movie? So another one is, of course, North Korean defectors also seeking back to their homeland and also want to meet their parents, siblings. So how about the collaboration with the North Korean refugees?
Okay, and then before you answer, let's just let Kemi ask the online question.
Yes. So I have two questions. The first one is that you've named the urgency with the aging generation of divided families. So what is your vision for how to keep this activism alive and how we maintain our connections as these concepts become more abstract to newer generations and as elders with these first-degree connections to North Korea have passed on? And the other question is there an online platform for separated families? If not, maybe such a solution is possible for a start.
Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go to each of you, and then you can answer whichever of the questions that you like, and we'll start with HJ.
So as a storyteller, we believe in authentic personal stories, and there's very little authentic personal stories about North Korea or divided families or anything there, like it. What we found is that the content we've been posting through Letters to My Hometown have been quite popular, especially with a lot of younger generation. And I think there's a genuine hunger amongst younger generation to learn real stories about people. Like, what are people like in North Korea? What are the real experiences of the Korean War? Aside from all of the politics, And right now, the only thing you see is things like Kim Jong-un, this and that and this, which is really not that exciting for a lot of younger folks. So I think for us, we're going to continue to tell real, authentic stories of human stories about North Korean life, divided families, and I think that's one way to keep the younger generation engaged.
My hands are full, so I really can't think of what we should do for our next generation, really. But there are some wonderful people who have made the documentary films, and also I think, hey, we got enough work to do. The story, I mean, what you guys take care of your problems. So we have a bright, I mean, unbelievably brilliant young generation here. I mean, I can point it right here. So they can do a lot better job than we do with the subjects.
Yeah, I wish I was tech savvy, social media savvy enough to have a TikTok channel, but I think it's really calling for the need of the next generation now. So I think that would be to those who are here and to those who are watching this message. If you have a story to share yourself or know someone in the community who might be interested in contributing to this project, because as Charlie said, it's too early to close this book. And this book doesn't only have one author. And I'm certainly not the first one. There's a long lineage, but I can't be the last one either. And Charlie can't be the last one. There's a great documentary, The Divided Families film by Jason Ahn, which is how I got started on this. But I would just encourage everyone to, one, check out the videos on the Korean American Story Letters to My Hometown page, social media, and to contribute and get involved if possible.
Again, I agree with the storytelling aspect. I mean, for myself, just the interactions that I've had with people like Chahi, you can't leave a meeting with Chahi without feeling motivated to get out and do more on this issue. So, but to her point earlier when she was talking about the first generation wanting the second generation to fly away from this issue, to fly away from that trauma from the past, I will just say, Chahi, your bravery and courage in talking about your experience is really important to this, and I hope that other first generation Korean Americans will think about that, because to mobilize the second and third generations, we do need those stories to be told through storytelling outlets, because there's nothing more impactful than that personal touch. And I know in many of the individuals that I've spoken to, they're like, I was afraid to tell my kids. I was worried that they would live in fear, that they were being chased in the same way that I was being chased, or that they would face discrimination if people knew that they were of North Korean origin. But thank you to Chahi and other brave people, the various individuals that Paul's had the opportunity to document in his series, and many of the other products that are out there. On the refugee issue, I do kind of want to tie back to that, because there have been two stories that have really left an impression on me recently, and the National Divided Families Coalition has been great, and many of my meetings with them, they've invited refugees to join my meetings with the Korean American divided family community. But I met with a North Korean defector who had escaped last year. And it was really interesting. When I met with him, he said, I know because for generations my family has talked about our one family member who lives in North America right now. And he was like, look, now that I'm out, I want to be reconnected with that family. Like, I don't know how to start. Gonna go and hopefully someday find this community, right? And this is an individual who is now probably, to be honest, third generation on the North Korean side, who is now all by himself in South Korea, who is thinking about, like, how can I find that extended family? He thinks it's a great uncle. So there are these components that are also through the refugee community, offer also little snippets or windows in. But also for that connectedness to your hometown. I met with another North Korean recently who's resettled here in the U.S., and she made Pyongyang-style naengmyeon and also just North Korean-style kimchi, or from her hometown. And she sent some of that kimchi home with everybody that came. We all went home with like a big bag. But one of the other individuals that was there was like, oh, I took it home to my grandma who was born in North Korea. And she was like, she tasted it and she was like, oh, this was just like the kimchi that my mom used to make. I haven't had kimchi this way, made this way, since I was a small girl. And so the tastes of food, right? A candy from North Korea, just some home cooking in a North Korean style can also help kind of refresh that connectedness to those memories. It's not the same as a reunification. It's not the same as a consistent contact with that loved one, but it can at least be a little piece of home for a short while. And so I would encourage people to think about ways to tap into the refugee community, the escapee community, and to think about what they have to offer and just helping build interconnectedness with North Koreans generally.
Great way to end that. I'd like to thank Ambassador Turner, Paul Lee, Chai Stanfield, H.J. Lee, Representative Sherman, Senator Kirk, also Lindy Setting and Kemi Adewaluri, my colleagues, and the AV team, and all of you for joining us and participating in the event today. Thank you so much.